The morning sun hadn't quite burned off the New Hampshire chill when Karoline Leavitt stepped out of her campaign van, adjusting the lapels of her navy blazer. Her heels clicked against the sidewalk as she made her way toward the small downtown plaza, where a crowd was already gathering. Signs bobbed above heads, some in support, a few skeptical, but she kept her smile steady, practiced. She'd done this dozens of times before. Handshakes, quick answers, a few selfies, then off to the next stop. Efficiency was everything on the trail. Her team moved like a well-oiled machine around her, press secretary holding a mic just out of frame, scheduler glancing at her watch, 2 volunteers handing out flyers with Karoline's face and a bold promise, a new voice for New Hampshire. Everything was on script, on time, on brand. Then, from the edge of the crowd, a man stepped forward. He wasn't loud, didn't wave a sign or shout a slogan, just stood there, shoulders slightly hunched, wearing a faded ball cap with VFW Post 89 stitched in white thread across the front. His hands were tucked into the pockets of a worn jacket and his eyes, steady, tired, locked onto hers as she passed. "Ms. Leavitt," he said, voice low but clear. She slowed for half a second, already turning toward the next supporter, a woman holding a baby, but paused just enough to acknowledge him. "Hi there," she said, offering a quick nod and that warm, camera-ready smile. "Thanks so much for coming out." "I served 22 years, he said gently. "I was hoping to talk to you about the wait times at the VA clinic in Concord. My buddy's been waiting 6 months just to see a specialist for his back. He can barely stand." Karoline's smile didn't fade, but her pace didn't stop either. She kept walking, her team falling in step behind her. "I hear you," she said over her shoulder, voice still kind but already shifting focus. "We're pushing hard on veterans care. Got a whole plan rolling out next week. You'll see it on our site." She reached for the baby's tiny hand, gave it a playful wiggle, and laughed at something the mother said. The exchange with the veteran was already folding into the background noise of the event, the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of volunteers, the click of a photographer's shutter. But the man didn't move. He just stood there watching her go. His name was James McAllister, though most folks called him Mac. He wasn't looking for a photo or a soundbite. He'd driven an hour that morning, left his coffee half-finished on the counter, because he'd seen Karoline's name on the event flyer and remembered her grandfather, his old squad leader, the man who once dragged him through knee-deep mud in Kuwait after a mortar blast, left him dazed and bleeding. That man had written letters to Mac's wife every month while they were deployed, had sent his own boots to Mac's son when the boy outgrew his. He'd been the kind of leader who remembered birthdays, who carried extra rations just in case someone forgot theirs. And now his granddaughter was running for office. Mac hadn't come to complain. Not really. He'd come because he believed she might listen. He'd even brought something, a yellowed envelope tucked in his inside pocket, sealed with a wax stamp that read, "For Karoline, when the time is right." Her grandfather had pressed it into Mac's hands 5 years ago, during a quiet afternoon on his porch not long before he passed. "She's got fire," he'd said. "But fire needs direction. Give her this if she ever steps into the arena." But Karoline hadn't seen any of that. She hadn't seen the tremor in his hands when he spoke, or the way his voice cracked just slightly on the word buddy. She hadn't noticed the dog tags glinting under his collar, or the purple heart pin tucked discreetly into his lapel. To her, in that moment, he was just another face in a long line of faces, a brief interruption in an already packed schedule. Back at the edge of the plaza, Mac turned and walked away. He didn't slam a door or raise his voice. He just folded his flyer, unopened, and slipped it into a nearby recycling bin. A young volunteer noticed him leaving and offered a sympathetic shrug. "She's swamped today," the kid said. "Maybe try the town hall next week?" Mac nodded but didn't answer. He knew it wasn't about being busy. It was about being seen. Meanwhile, Karoline was already on stage, microphone in hand, delivering crisp talking points about economic opportunity and border security. The crowd clapped at the right moments. Her delivery was smooth, confident. But halfway through her speech, her eyes flickered toward the spot where the veteran had stood. It was empty now. Still, something about the way he'd looked at her, like he knew her, or at least knew the person she was supposed to become, stuck in her mind like a burr. Later, in the van heading to her next stop, her scheduler scrolled through social media updates. "Good turnout," she said. "Local papers running a piece. Oh, and there's a short clip going around from a guy with a phone. Nothing major. Just you talking to that older guy in the VFW hat. Karoline glanced at the screen. The video was only 15 seconds long. There she was, smiling, moving fast. And there he was, standing still, saying something she couldn't hear through the phone's tinny speaker. His expression shifting from hope to something quieter, something like disappointment. She watched it twice. Who is he? She asked. No idea, the scheduler said, already typing an email. Probably just another concerned citizen. We'll add him to the follow-up list. Karoline didn't answer. She stared out the window as the van rolled past rows of brick storefronts and leaf-strewn sidewalks. For the first time all day, the script felt thin. Like she'd missed a line, not just in the conversation, but in something bigger. She didn't know his name. Didn't know his story. Didn't know that the man she'd brushed past carried a piece of her own family's history in his coat pocket. All she knew was the look in his eyes and the strange, sinking feeling that in her rush to be everywhere at once, she'd failed to be present where it mattered most. And though she wouldn't admit it yet, not even to herself, that moment, brief as it was, had already begun to change everything. The next morning, Mac sat at his kitchen table with a chipped mug of black coffee, staring out the window at the frost-touched grass. The encounter from the day before replayed in his head, not with anger, but with a quiet kind of sadness. He'd seen politicians come and go for decades. Some listened. Most didn't. He'd hoped Karoline might be different, not just because of her last name, but because of the way her grandfather used to talk about family, how he'd say, "Blood means nothing if you don't carry the heart too." Mac reached into his jacket, still hanging on the back of the chair, and pulled out the envelope. It felt heavier than it should. The paper was old, slightly brittle at the edges, but the wax seal was intact. He ran his thumb over it gently, remembering the day it was given to him. They'd been sitting on matching rocking chairs on the porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. Her grandfather had been thinner then, voice weaker, but his eyes, sharp as ever, had held Max without blinking. "She's got your fire," he'd said, nodding toward a photo of Karoline on his side table, taken when she was in college. But fire without direction burns everything, including itself. If she ever runs, give her this. Not before. And don't let her staff toss it in a filing cabinet. Mac had promised, and he always kept his word. He didn't open the letter. Not yet. He wasn't sure he should. Maybe she wasn't ready. Maybe he'd read too much into a rushed moment. After all, campaigns were chaos, smiles on a loop, hands shaking until they ached, decisions made in seconds that felt like hours. He knew that. He'd worked a few local races back in the 90s, helping vets run for city council. He understood the pressure, but this felt different. Later that day, while sorting through old shoeboxes in his closet, looking for a spare charger, he came across a photo album. Dusty, spine cracked, filled with Polaroids and folded letters. He hadn't opened it in years. Flipping it open, there they were. Two young men in desert fatigues, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning like they hadn't just spent 3 days without sleep. That was him and Karoline's grandfather, right after they returned from Operation Desert Storm. In the margin, in her grandfather's messy scrawl, "Mac saved my life. I just handed him a canteen. Fair trade," Mac smiled faintly, then turned the page. There was another photo, him, older now, standing beside a casket draped in an American flag. Karoline's grandfather's funeral. She'd been there, just a teenager, eyes red-rimmed but dry, standing straight-backed beside her mother. Mac remembered approaching her afterward, wanting to say something meaningful, but she'd been surrounded by relatives and he didn't want to intrude, so he'd just nodded from a distance. She hadn't seen him. Now, years later, she was running for Congress, and he'd stood right in front of her, and she hadn't seen him then either. That evening, Mac called his old friend Rita, who still worked part-time at the county clerk's office. "You remember that Leavitt girl?" he asked. "The one running for office?" "Sure do," Rita said. "She's all over the radio. Sharp as a tack. Her grandfather ever talk about me?" There was a pause. Then softly, "All the time, Mac, every Veterans Day." He'd stop by the post with a six-pack and say, "This one's for Mac. He's the reason I got to see my grandkids." "You think she doesn't know your name?" "She might not recognize your face, but she's heard your name since she could talk." Mac hung up, heart thudding in a way it hadn't in years. Meanwhile, Across town, Karoline sat in her campaign office, reviewing debate prep notes. But her mind kept drifting back to the man in the VFW cap. She'd asked her team twice now if they'd gotten his name, but no one had written it down. He didn't leave contact info, her field organizer said. Just walked off. Frustrated, Karoline opened her laptop and typed, VFW Post 89 New Hampshire. A list popped up. She scrolled through member photos, mostly older men, many with the same quiet strength in their posture. None looked exactly like him, but that didn't mean anything. She clicked on the About page and read about the Post's history. Founded in 1946, served over 200 local veterans, hosted monthly breakfasts, supported families of deployed troops. Then something caught her eye. Under notable members, there was a short paragraph. James Mac McAllister, Gulf War veteran, Purple Heart recipient, and longtime friend of the late Robert Leavitt, who served alongside him in the 1st Marine Division. Her breath hitched. Robert Leavitt. Her grandfather. She stared at the screen, the words blurring for a second. Her grandfather rarely talked about the war, but when he did, he always mentioned one name, Mac. The man who kept me honest, he'd say. The one who reminded me that courage isn't just about charging forward. It's about standing still when someone needs you. She'd assumed Mac was long gone. Passed away, maybe, or moved far away. She never imagined he was still here, still in the same town, still wearing that cap, still trying to do the right thing, and she'd brushed him off like he was just another stranger. A wave of shame washed over her, hot and sudden, not because of politics, not because of optics, but because this man had known her grandfather, really known him in a way she never could. He'd shared foxholes and fears, jokes and silence. He carried memories of her family that lived nowhere else. And when he'd reached out, she'd treated him like background noise. She closed her laptop slowly, her earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, heavier. This wasn't just about a missed handshake. It was about a broken thread, one that connected her to the very values she claimed to stand for. That night, she didn't rehearse talking points. She dug out an old shoebox from her closet, the one labeled Grandpa. Inside were birthday cards, fishing lures, a pocket knife with his initials, and a single faded photo of 2 young Marines, arms around each other, grinning under a desert sun. On the back, in her grandfather's handwriting, me and Mac, Kuwait, 91, still owe him a beer. She held the photo for a long time, and for the first time since launching her campaign, Karoline didn't think about polls or press or strategy. She thought about showing up, not as a candidate, but as a granddaughter, as someone who owed a debt she hadn't even known existed. She didn't know what she'd say when she saw him again, but she knew she had to try. The next morning, Karoline woke before sunrise. Not because her alarm went off, she hadn't set one, but because her mind wouldn't let her rest. The image of that man in the VFW cap kept returning, not as a blur in a crowd, but as someone real, someone tied to the very roots of who she was supposed to be. She made coffee in silence, the steam curling into the dim kitchen light, and stared out the window at the quiet street. For weeks, her days had been a blur of talking points, handshakes, and rehearsed answers. But now something had shifted. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't optics. It was conscience. She called her scheduler before 7. Cancel my first 2 stops, she said, voice firmer than she expected. I need to take care of something personal. There was a pause on the other end. Is everything okay? It will be, Karoline said. Just reschedule and see if you can find an address for James McAllister. VFW Post 89. He's connected to my grandfather. Her scheduler didn't ask why. Maybe she heard something in Karoline's voice, something that didn't sound like campaign mode. By 8, Karoline was in her car, driving through neighborhoods she rarely visited. Tree-lined streets with modest homes, porches with rocking chairs, American flags hanging slightly faded from summer sun. She wasn't sure what she'd say when she got there. Apologize, yes, but how do you apologize for not seeing someone who mattered long before you even knew their name? She found the house easily, a small, well-kept place with a neatly trimmed lawn and a pickup truck in the driveway. A VFW flag hung beside the front door. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned off the engine. This wasn't a rally. There were no cameras, no crowd, no script. Just her, and a choice. She walked up the path, heart pounding like she was walking into a debate instead of a front porch. Before she could knock, the door opened. Mac stood there holding a newspaper and a mug of coffee. He looked surprised, but not angry. Just tired, like he'd been expecting something else entirely. "Ms. Leavitt," he said after a moment. "Please," she said, voice softer than she'd used all campaign. "Call me Karoline." He studied her for a long second, then stepped aside. "Come in." The house smelled like old books, coffee, and wood polish. Photos lined the hallway. Military portraits, family gatherings, a black and white shot of two young men in uniform, arms slung over each other's shoulders. She recognized her grandfather instantly. And the other man, Mac, decades younger, grinning like he hadn't a care in the world. They sat at the kitchen table. No aides, no notes. Just two people and the weight of a moment neither had planned for. "I'm sorry," Karoline said before he could speak. "I didn't know who you were yesterday. But even if I had, I should have listened." "You deserved that much." Mac didn't answer right away. He set his mug down and looked out the window, where a pair of cardinals flitted between branches. "Your grandfather used to say that most people hear with their ears, but leaders listen with their eyes," he said finally. "He meant they see the person behind the words." Karoline swallowed. "I failed at that." "Maybe," Mac said. "Or maybe you just forgot, for a minute, who you're supposed to be." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the envelope. The wax seal was still unbroken. "He gave me this 5 years ago. Said to give it to you if you ever ran for office. Said you'd need it more then than ever." Her breath caught. She took the envelope slowly, like it might crumble in her hands. The paper was thin, yellowed at the edges, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Her grandfather's looping script. "For Karoline, when the time is right." She didn't open it. Not yet. She just held it, feeling the weight of all the things left unsaid between generations. "Why didn't you tell me yesterday?" she asked quietly. "You could have said his name." Mac gave a small, sad smile. "Would it have mattered? You were already halfway down the street, and I didn't want you to talk to me because of who I was to him. I wanted you to talk to me because of who I am now, a veteran who's watching his friends suffer while paperwork piles up. That's the real issue, not the past." She looked down, ashamed again. He was right. She'd been so focused on moving forward, on winning, that she'd forgotten that leadership isn't just about big speeches. It's about the quiet moments, the ones no one films. They talked for over an hour after that. Not about policy drafts or campaign timelines, but about real things. About how the VA clinic in Concord had cut its physical therapy hours. About a neighbor who'd waited 8 months for a mental health appointment. About how some vets felt invisible once the parades ended. Mac spoke without bitterness, just honesty. And Karoline listened. Really listened. For the first time in months. When she finally stood to leave, she held out her hand. But Mac surprised her. He pulled her into a brief, firm hug, the kind her grandfather used to give, strong and steady. "You've got his fire," he said, stepping back. "Now make sure you've got his heart too." She nodded, eyes stinging. "I'll try." Back in her car, she finally opened the letter. Her grandfather's words filled 2 pages. No grand speeches, no political advice. Just this. "If you're reading this, you've stepped into the arena. Good. But remember, power means nothing if you lose sight of the people who put you there. Listen to the quiet voices. They're usually the ones telling the truth." She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket. Not for show, for herself. That afternoon, instead of heading to her rescheduled event, she called the VA outreach coordinator in Concord. "I'd like to visit the clinic," she said. "Not for a photo op, just to listen." And for the first time since launching her campaign, Karoline didn't feel like she was playing a part. She felt like she was finally becoming the person her grandfather, and Mac, had always believed she could be. The drive to Concord felt different this time. No campaign van, no staff in the back seat rehearsing talking points, no schedule blinking on her phone every 5 minutes. Just Karoline, her coat, and the folded letter tucked in her inside pocket like a compass. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that makes everything feel quieter, more honest. She rolled down the window a little, letting the cool air brush her face, trying to steady the nervous flutter in her chest. She wasn't going as a candidate today. She was going as someone who'd finally understood that listening wasn't a campaign tactic. It was the whole point. The VA clinic sat on the edge of town, A low brick building with peeling paint and a parking lot, half empty except for a few older cars. She parked near the entrance, took a breath, and walked in without fanfare. No press, no announcement. Just a woman in a blazer who looked like she belonged anywhere but here. Inside, the waiting room was quiet, filled with the kind of silence that comes from exhaustion, not peace. A few men and women sat in worn chairs, some flipping through outdated magazines, others staring at the floor. One older man tapped his foot restlessly, his knee wrapped in a brace. A woman in her 60s scrolled through her phone, dark circles under her eyes. Nobody looked up when Karoline entered. She didn't introduce herself right away. Instead, she sat in the back near a window and just watched, listened. Over the next hour, she heard fragments of conversations about delayed prescriptions, lost paperwork, specialists who'd retired without notice. One veteran muttered to his wife, "Feels like they forgot we exist once the medals are handed out." His wife just squeezed his hand and said nothing. Finally, a nurse called a name, and Karoline stood. "Excuse me," she said gently to the front desk clerk, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Diane. "I'm not here for an appointment. I just wanted to talk, if that's okay." Diane raised an eyebrow but didn't seem surprised. "You with the news?" "No," Karoline said. "I'm running for Congress, but today I'm just here to listen." Diane studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Honey, if you really want to hear the truth, grab a coffee and come back during lunch. That's when the staff actually has 5 minutes to breathe." So Karoline did. She bought 2 coffees from the gas station across the street and returned just before noon. Diane met her in the hallway, arms crossed but not unkindly. "All right," she said, "but keep it real. These folks don't need another politician promising the moon." Over the next 2 hours, Karoline sat in a small break room with 3 nurses, a social worker, and a retired Marine who now volunteered as a patient advocate. They didn't hold back. They talked about staffing shortages, outdated systems, forms that took weeks to process, and veterans who gave up before they got help. One nurse, her voice cracking slightly, said, "We see people who faced bullets without flinching, but they break down in our waiting room because they can't get someone to answer the phone." Karoline took notes, not on a tablet, but in a small notebook she'd carried since college. She asked questions not to sound smart, but because she genuinely didn't know, and for the first time, she realized how much of her campaign plan had been built on data points, not human faces. When she left the clinic, the sky had cleared slightly, pale sunlight breaking through the clouds. She didn't head straight back to her office. Instead, she drove to a diner she remembered from childhood. Booths with cracked vinyl, coffee that tasted like it had been brewed that morning, and pie that came with a side of gossip. She ordered black coffee and sat in a corner booth, pulling out her notebook, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Mac. She pulled out her phone and dialed his number, the one her scheduler had found the night before. He answered on the 3rd ring. "It's Karoline," she said. "I figured," he replied, voice calm. "You sound different." "I feel different," she admitted. "I went to the Concord clinic today." "What you said. It's worse than I thought." There was a pause. Then, "Good. Now you know it's not just one story." "It's not," she said. "And I've been talking about veterans' care like it's a bullet point on a flyer. But it's not. It's people. Real people waiting in rooms that smell like antiseptic and disappointment." Mac was quiet for a moment. Then softly, "Your grandfather used to say policy without empathy is just paperwork with a flag on it." She smiled faintly. He was right. They talked a while longer, about how to fix things, not with grand promises, but with small, steady changes. More telehealth options, dedicated case managers, faster appeals. Nothing flashy, just functional, human. That evening, Karoline called her policy team. "Scrap the veterans section of the platform," she said. "We're rewriting it from the ground up, and I want every draft reviewed by actual veterans, not just consultants." Her policy director sounded stunned. "But the rollout's in 3 days. Then we'll be late," Karoline said. Better late than hollow. Over the next week, something shifted in her campaign, not in strategy, but in spirit. She started holding informal gatherings at VFW halls, not with podiums or banners, but with folding chairs and coffee urns. She didn't lead with her resume. She asked questions. She listened. And slowly, people began to open up. Not because she was running for office, but because she finally seemed like someone worth trusting. One afternoon, she returned to Mac's house, this time with a thick folder of revised policy ideas. "I want your honest take," she said. "Not as a supporter, as someone who's lived it." He read through it slowly, sipping tea from the same chipped mug. When he finished, he looked up. "It's not perfect," he said, "but it's real, and that's a start." She stayed for dinner that night, meatloaf and mashed potatoes, the kind her grandfather used to love. They talked about his wife, who'd passed 10 years ago, about her childhood summers spent fishing with her grandfather, about how both of them missed him in ways they couldn't quite explain. Before she left, Mac handed her something else. A small, laminated photo of him and her grandfather, taken at a reunion years ago. "Keep it," he said, "so you never forget who's watching." She tucked it into her briefcase next to the letter, and as she drove home under a sky full of stars, Karoline didn't think about polls or headlines. She thought about the man in the waiting room with the knee brace, the nurse who cried in the break room, the quiet dignity of a veteran who'd waited decades just to be seen. She finally understood. Leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about making space for the ones that had been drowned out. The night before her biggest campaign speech yet, Karoline sat alone in her hotel room, the city lights flickering beyond the window like distant stars. Her notes were spread across the bed, talking points on the economy, border security, education. But none of it felt right. Not anymore. She kept thinking about the faces she'd met over the past few weeks. The nurse in Concord who worked double shifts just to keep up. The veteran who'd waited 8 months for a hearing aid. The quiet nod Mac gave her when she finally got something right. Those weren't just stories to quote. They were reasons to show up. She crumpled the draft and started over. This time, she didn't lead with promises. She began with a moment, small, unscripted, human. She wrote about a man in a VFW cap who stepped forward not to ask for anything grand, just to be heard. She didn't name him. She didn't need to. Anyone who'd been overlooked would recognize themselves in that story. The next evening, the auditorium was packed. Cameras lined the back, reporters tapped on laptops, and supporters held signs with her name in bold letters. But when she walked on stage, she didn't reach for the teleprompter. She set her notes aside and looked out at the crowd, not as a candidate scanning for applause, but as someone trying to connect. "Last month," she began, voice steady but soft, "I made a mistake. I was in a hurry. There was a schedule to keep, a crowd to move through, and a man who just wanted to talk about his friend's back pain. I smiled, said the right words, and kept walking. And in that moment I failed, not just him, but everything my grandfather taught me about service." A hush fell over the room. No one expected this. "I thought leadership was about having all the answers," she continued. "But I've learned it's really about knowing when to stop, look someone in the eye, and say, 'Tell me more.' Because real change doesn't start in press releases. It starts in waiting rooms, kitchen tables, and quiet conversations where no one's watching." She spoke for 20 minutes, not about herself, but about the people she'd met. She described the VA clinic not as a policy problem, but as a place where dignity was slipping through the cracks. She talked about how veterans didn't need another statue. They needed someone to cut through the red tape that kept them from seeing a doctor. She didn't offer magic solutions. She offered commitment, to listen first, act second, and never confuse speed with progress. When she finished, the applause wasn't the usual campaign roar. It was slower, deeper, like people were clapping not just for her words, but for the honesty behind them. Afterward, a reporter asked, "Was that a pivot in your campaign strategy?" Karoline shook her head. "It's not strategy. It's who I'm trying to become." The speech went viral, not because it was flashy, but because it felt true. Veterans shared clips with captions like, "Finally, someone who gets it." Local news stations ran segments not on her platform, but on the quiet shift happening in her approach. Even political opponents acknowledged the change wasn't performative. It was personal. But the real test came a week later, at a town hall in a small community center outside Dover. The room was modest, folding chairs, a wobbly microphone, a coffee pot that had seen better days. Only about 40 people showed up. No cameras. No headlines waiting. Just regular folks with real concerns. Karoline didn't stand behind a podium. She sat in a circle with them. A woman in her 70s raised her hand. My husband served in Vietnam. He's been on a wait list for hearing aids for over a year. Every time we call, they say soon, but soon never comes. Karoline didn't deflect, didn't pivot to a broader talking point. She leaned forward. What's his name? Frank? The woman said, surprised. I'll call the VA director tomorrow, Karoline said. Not as a candidate. As someone who owes your family better, and I'll follow up until it's done. She didn't make a show of it, but the next day she did exactly that. And within a week, Frank had an appointment. Word spread, not through press releases but through phone calls between neighbors, conversations at diners, nods exchanged at post meetings. People started believing she meant what she said, not because she shouted it, but because she showed up quietly, consistently, without fanfare. Mac watched it all from a distance. He didn't attend every event. He didn't need to. He saw the change in the way she paused before answering, in the way she remembered names, in the way she carried herself, not like someone chasing power, but like someone trying to honor a promise. One afternoon, he received a plain envelope in the mail. Inside was a handwritten note. Thank you for stopping me before I lost my way. I carry your words and his with me every day. Tucked inside was a photo from the town hall, Karoline kneeling beside an older veteran, listening intently. On the back, she'd written, "This is what service looks like." He smiled and pinned it to his fridge, right next to the old photo of him and her grandfather. As election day neared, Karoline's team worried she wasn't staying on message. Too much focus on small stories, not enough on big wins. But she held firm. People don't vote for platforms, she told them. They vote for people they trust. And slowly, trust grew. Not because she was perfect, but because she was trying to be real. On the morning of the election, Karoline didn't hold a rally. She drove to Concord, walked into the VA clinic, and sat in the waiting room with a cup of coffee. No announcement, no signs. Just her waiting like everyone else. An older man glanced at her. You're that candidate, aren't you? I am, she said. He nodded. You're the first one who ever came back. She didn't know if she'd win that night. But in that moment, it didn't matter. Because she'd already won something harder. The quiet respect of people who'd spent lifetimes being ignored. And whether or not she took office, she'd carry that lesson forward, not as a campaign slogan, but as a compass, because leadership, she now knew, wasn't about standing on a stage. It was about kneeling beside someone who needed to be seen.